Ms. Vienne, I hope that you'll enjoy your visit to the Environmental Committee. It's a very interesting committee. We are starting a study on the federal role on fresh water, and we have two panels. I'd like to point out that for the first panel, all of those who are online have already undergone sound quality tests, so that's been done. And we have with us, appearing as an individual and in person, the law professor from the University of Quebec, Montreal, Professor Alexandre Lilot. Thank you for coming here. We're very pleased that you are here. And we have 3 witnesses online, I believe. I can't see the screen either, so is there any way that we can view the witnesses on screen? Can the witnesses online turn on their cameras so that we can see them? Good. But I still don't see anything on the screen.
From the BC Wildlife Federation, Executive Director Jesse Zeman, and the founder of the Eco Ambassador nonprofit, I assume, Ms. Lakshmi Begum, and from Wild Sight, which is another NGO, we have Wyatt Patrician, the science policy advisor. So each witness will have a 5-minute opening statement, and then we'll proceed to a couple of rounds of questioning. I hope we can get 2 rounds in. Actually, it's going to be 1 round, I guess, because it's a 1-hour panel. So, yeah. Okay, so we'll start. Est-ce qu'on peut commencer?
So we can begin with Professor Lilot.
Before we begin the testimony, I wonder if we could just briefly discuss the committee business that's set for the end of the meeting. I think we're set to go to 1:30, and
yeah.
I believe some members have other commitments at 1 o'clock, and I wonder if either we could break 10 minutes early for committee business at 12:50 and have a very short committee business session so that we can still get out of here at 1, or if we could postpone the committee business to another meeting. 1:30?
It's a notice said
Only 1:15.
You're with me. Thank you.
well, let's. I guess it's up to the committee to decide. So why don't you table a motion? What's your motion?
I'll move that we adjourn to committee business at 12:50.
Okay.
Just 10. It reduces our meeting.
Put your hands up if you agree. 1, 2. So okay. Who agrees? 1, 2, 3, 4. Who doesn't agree? 1, 2, 3, 4. Vous êtes pour. Donc,
You're in favor.
Hands again if you're for. So, Madame Posé, 1, 2. Ben, c'est OK, c'est ce qu'on va faire. Mais
So that's what we'll do. But I think that given the circumstances, we're going to be wasting time.
12:50 to do future business, but we're losing time. We're losing time on the study, so I think I'm going to try to make it up somehow.
And then, so, Mr. Chair, what are we doing with the first? Is there 2 rounds on the first round then, or?
We'll see how it goes. I doubt there'll be 2 rounds because we have opening statements. So,
okay.
Yeah, okay. So we'll start with Professor Lilot for 5 minutes, please.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, dear committee members, I'd like to thank you for today's invitation. My name is Alexandre Lilot, and I'm a law professor at UQAM, and my expertise deals with water law and governance, questions I've been focusing on now for 10 years. I actually obtained my PhD and postdoc at the University of Ottawa, so I'm very pleased to come back in the region. I don't know if there are any Pokemon fans here, but I have the impression I'm kind of like a carapace that comes back to the Kanto region. Dear committee members, we're at a watershed moment. Water-related problems have never been so frequent, intense, and complicated. That's a fact. Whereas the water governance tools have not been adapted to fully comprehend the consequences of these problems, we now find ourselves in a situation that is unique, both politically and jurisdictionally in the country. For the creation of the Canada Water Agency, the implementation of the Freshwater Action Plan, the modernization of the Canada Water Resources Act are initiatives that may enable us to change the landscape of water right and governments from coast to coast and for decades to become. However, this is not one in advance, and it would be essential that we look at things newly. So today, I'd like to draw your attention not only to the importance of taking a coordinated approach between government levels, but also on the federal government's role in such a context. Since the start of your study on freshwater, you've heard about the diversity of the issues and the various stakeholders pertaining to water. The difficulty, you will agree, is that we're dealing with a situation that is transporter, intersectorial, and interjurisdictional. That's why a coordinated intergovernmental action is inevitable if we want to really get a full grasp of these growing issues. Canada-wide initiative would be desirable if we want to collectively be equipped in order to manage the water throughout the country in a spirit of cooperative federalism. Moreover, I believe that intergovernmental cooperation with respect to water should reflect various transformative considerations. It should implement decisions made by NGOs present on the field. It should also envision the possibility of viewing water as a standalone entity, as a whole stakeholder. Water has an impact on our way of living, on the way that we do things, just as we influence its nature and composition. And this cooperation should seize the opportunity to make a step ahead in reconciling with the First Nations by integrating Indigenous representation and implementing their governance methods. The federal government must play an important role. The federal government does not have exclusive jurisdiction over water management, which involves many jurisdictions, but the federal government is the only level of government that's able to catalyze, if you like, intergovernmental cooperation throughout the country, an undertaking that provinces alone cannot do or undertake. Its role is to initiate action and facilitate the implementation of a common process and coordinate its achievement. And we should specify that there are already legal or jurisdictional strategies to implement pan-Canadian water management. There is always the possibility of bilateral agreements. But this alone is not enough. It has to be completed by human resources, financial resources, material resources, and political will. It's not an easy task, but the Canadian federalism enables us to envision a harmonized cooperative model capable of preserving the diversity and wealth of the regions. It's quite ironic to specify that these considerations are not new in itself. Certain Canadian water right reports already launched and sounded the alarm about this more than 50 years ago. But this is a new situation. The urgency is becoming more and more problematic and more pronounced. But it's also a great opportunity. And thank you. We will now turn to Mr. Zeman, the Executive Director of BC Wildlife Federation. Please go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be a witness. The BC Wildlife Federation is British Columbia's leading conservation organization. We are also the largest and oldest conservation organization with over 41,000 members and 100 clubs across the province. As it relates to fish, watersheds, and wetlands, our clubs and members put hundreds of thousands of volunteer hours and dollars conducting wetland and fish habitat restoration across the province, and advocating for legislative, regulatory, and policy changes to support a future that includes healthy watersheds and vibrant fish populations. Over the past 2 years in the world of fish, water, and wetlands, the BC Wildlife Federation has delivered over 100 projects totaling over $5.5 million while partnering with over 49 First Nations communities. Since 2021, we've delivered over 230 projects and over $10 million worth of on-the-ground restoration. Our partners include First Nations, ENGOs, local communities, private landholders, the Government of Canada, and the province of BC. In British Columbia, spring freshet comes earlier and it's happening faster, which means floods, erosion, sedimentation, and sometimes even landslides. In the summers, we have watersheds with chronic low flows, rivers which are too hot to support native species, and of course, we have catastrophic wildfires. Wildfires only exacerbate future issues with sustainable watersheds in subsequent years and decades. To make the point, this summer, the province of British Columbia declared a state of emergency, as did a number of its communities across the province for drought and wildfire. Nearly 80% of BC's water basins were in level 4 or 5 drought. It's now November and we still have communities affected by this summer's drought, and at least 2 communities which were still on a state of local emergency as of yesterday. 2 years ago, at this exact same time, we were dealing with the atmospheric river, which was the most costly weather event in BC's history. As it relates to taking care of our watershed, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Today, I'm going to touch on 2 topics, funding and regulation. Funding. The environment, including water, is the first thing to get cut during an economic downturn and the last thing to receive a bump when the economy is strong. Our fish and watersheds operate on timescales of years, decades, and centuries, not 4-year cycles when Canadians...
Just a moment, please. We'll pause. Oui, Madame Posey.
Oui, c'est qu'il y a un problème de micro, je pense, parce que là, l'interprète n'est pas capable
Okay.
de traduire.
I'm wondering if it's the placement of the mic. What normally it should be higher or lower. Could we find out what the problem is? Is it
Plus proche, peut-être.
I don't know what that.
Le son n'est pas clair, dit-elle.
Pardon?
Qu'est-ce que la madame...
Could you lower your? The boom there? Do you think?
Certainly.
Can we just test it? Can you tell us?
Yep. Is this helpful or a better placement?
No, it doesn't seem to be good.
All?
They passed the sound test though.
Yeah, they did.
Yep, we sound tested. You bet.
Maybe it's connection.
Maybe it's the connection.
Shouldn't be the connection.
Is it your system is on mic as opposed to not being on mic and picking up the sound through the speaker or whatever?
No, it's showing.
Everything's fine. The test was. What about now? What about? How's it now? No, it's we'll go to Dr. Begum and we'll come back to you, please. Mr. Heyman, I don't know how we'll solve the problem. Maybe the technicians will do another sound test. Okay, so we were at 2:28. I'm sorry about that. I apologize, but we have to protect the health and safety of the interpreters. Dr. Begum, can we go to you for 5 minutes?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
I hope you are hearing me well. Thank you for inviting me to this committee meeting. I'm Lakshmi Begum, and I'm here today as an individual expert to share my knowledge and perspective. I have more than 20 years of experience in the water, wastewater, and waste management sector, and I have worked for federal government, provincial government, and several major consulting engineering firms in Ontario. My experience include water and wastewater treatment plant update, technology selection, program development, and project delivery. I'm also the founder of TheEcoAmbassador.com, the focus of which is to create environmental protection and prevention awareness. I'm also an active member of Canada Water and Wastewater Association and Water Environment Association of Ontario. The focus of my statement today is different contaminants of emerging concern found in wastewater and biosolids. A detailed brief had been submitted to this committee earlier regarding this study, outlining those contaminants alongside with their available removal technologies. Today, I'll leave those technical part and I'll go directly to the findings and suggestions regarding them. So the different group of contaminants in wastewater and biosolid that are getting recent attention are as follows. PAR and polyfluoroalkyl substance, commonly known as PFAS, pharmaceutical and personal care products, microplastics, and endocrine disrupting chemicals. The removal of these contaminants is a necessity from source water and wastewater, as they may have considerable effect on biophysical environment and living organism, depending on their concentration. These contaminants generally cannot be successfully eliminated by conventional treatment methods. Advanced treatment technologies, sometimes in combination, are required to remove them, in some extent, depending on the contaminants and their concentration. A multiple barrier approach is more effective than a single advanced technology for their elimination. Usually, these treatment technologies are expensive with a higher capital and operating cost and complex to operate. Upgrading the existing treatment plants with advanced technologies will require extensive capital and operating cost. In such case, focus should be shifted to source control, product elimination, or replacement with suitable alternative products that actually leaching those contaminants. So polyfluoroalkyl substance, or PFAS, also known as forever chemicals due to their long-lasting chemical bond, are a group of more than 12,000 chemicals, is raising concern due to their potential hazard to human health and environment. The fact that PFAS are used in different consumer and industrial products, they are ubiquitous in nature as they can enter the environment in so many different pathways via air, water, and land. PFAS has been detected in wastewater and biosolid too, and because of their widespread nature, and that raised concern regarding biosolid suitability of land application. As PFAS are mainly a chemical compound commonly used in many different consumer products, they end up in trace amounts in wastewater, biosolid, and other residuals. But if the treatment plant received PFAS contaminated sewage in the collection system from nearby sources such as industries, then the concentration of PFAS in sewage and sludge will be much higher than that of ambient concentration. Many countries have implemented industrial pretreatment, such as Michigan in USA, and thus prevented those contaminants to entering the environment and wastewater treatment plant in a high concentration. Currently, there are extensive research going on regarding PFAS, their quantification protocol, detection limit, exposure impact on health among various research and scientific committees. Regulators and decision makers should closely follow those research and scientific findings and make them the basis of their law and enforcement tools. So far, source reduction of PFAS compounds and phasing out their usage were the most efficient to reduce risk and potential concern related to PFAS in wastewater and biosolid. Recent research also found that level of PFAS in rainwater sometimes exceeds level deemed safe by different health and environmental advisory agencies. PFAS can travel through rainwater, potentially contaminating water sources around the world. In such a case, a global agreement on source control and product elimination is a must. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Mr. Petrushin from WildSite for 5 minutes, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. As you had said, my name is Wyatt Patrician. I am currently the Science Policy Advisor for WildSite, a volunteer position which I've held from the fall of this year, and this preceded my role as WildSite's mining policy and impacts researcher. Before beginning, I do want to thank the committee for accommodating my ability to appear virtually from New Haven, Connecticut. Within the Elk Valley of southeastern British Columbia, coal mining has occurred for over 100 years. Initially operating as underground mines, within the later part of the 20th century, these mines had transitioned into the large mountaintop removal coal mines we see today, becoming a major supplier of high-grade steelmaking coal to Asia-Pacific countries. Overshadowing the expansion of mountaintop removal coal mines in the Elk Valley, with current production estimates between 26.5 and 28.7 million short tons of coal annually, has been the worsening water quality that threatens other aspects of the economy, ways of life, and watershed security. From 1985 to 2022, selenium concentrations have increased by 443%, nitrates by 697%, and sulfates by 129% in the Elk River at Highway 93. This is at a federal provincial monitoring station located approximately 74 kilometers downstream from the nearest coal mines. Selenium is known to cause reproductive failure in fish, which can lead to the collapse of freshwater ecosystems. Contamination released from these mines has become a chronic problem wherein exceedances occur frequently to British Columbia's water quality guidelines for the protection of aquatic health and for drinking water. Through the almost 3 decades of known selenium contamination leaching into the watershed, numerous task forces and panels have failed to take meaningful action to solve the problem, which has occurred alongside the worsening water quality and coal mine expansion. The Auditor General of British Columbia, May 2016 report, An Audit of Compliance and Enforcement of the Mining Sector, provides a succinct summary of this history. We are currently at a crossroads in the management of water resources in Canada. We acknowledge the critical importance of clean water, both for society and within ecosystems, but we've typically followed a path that maintains the status quo, endangering these resources in the first place. WildSite has been actively engaged with the federal government on the creation of the proposed coal mining effluent regulations, which we believe is a positive step in helping to remedy the contamination crisis unfolding in the Elk Valley. However, these regulations have not yet been released. Furthermore, action by the province of British Columbia under Ministerial Order M113 requiring Teck Resources to stabilize and reduce contamination entering the watershed has been an abject failure, amplifying the ineffectiveness of provincial and federal fines to force the mines into compliance. The sale of Teck Resources' coal mining business to Glencore may likely worsen this situation. To remedy these concerns, WildSite is recommending to this committee that the implementation of co-governance frameworks is one of the best tools that could be collectively deployed to address the ongoing mismanagement of water resources both in the Elk Valley and beyond. Co-governance frameworks would enable decision-making to be shared across all levels of government within local communities and with First Nations that encompass entire ecological systems, thereby providing the structure required for effective management, monitoring, and prioritization of local objectives that rely both on direct community involvement, but also the inclusion of the nation state to supplement capacity and provide the tools required to address multifaceted issues. Furthermore, watershed scale co-governance is the only framework whereby diverse value systems can be brought together to support pluralistic decision making. Traditionally, resource extraction has superseded other values in the Elk Valley, but under a co-governance framework, decisions can be made to support a diverse set of stakeholder values like watershed security, ecological intactness, and sustainable development that in the past has been marginalized. Actionable items by the Canadian government include the immediate formation of Indigenous-led watershed boards for watersheds along transboundary regions, and the development of similar co-governance structures elsewhere in Canada. Furthermore, the federal government needs to move to finalize the proposed coal mining effluent regulations and ensure federal agencies undertake strict enforcement action for industries that are in non-compliance with Canada's existing laws that protect water resources and aquatic health. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. How are we doing with still on the phone? Okay. I think we'll just move to questions. The first round of questioning. We'll see how you have about 2.5 minutes left, but let's talk about the weather to see if the sound quality is good. You have to, but I think you're muted now. Is that possible? No, we don't hear you, unfortunately.
How does that work for everyone?
Yeah. Okay. Now we hear you. Is the sound quality okay? Can you say a few things of interest?
Sure. I could say all kinds of things about what's happening here in British Columbia this summer. And if we get an opportunity to continue the presentation, I'll round that out.
Okay, I haven't gotten the thumbs down. Thumbs up. You're good to go. So please, you have 2.5 minutes left. No, now it's down.
Okay. Thumbs down now. After testing again.
So it says, Mr. Scarpelletti.
Yeah.
So it says that it's passable, but they may interrupt.
Okay, so it's passable, but they may interrupt. So maybe also if you speak slowly, maybe it'll be easier for the interpreters. I don't know, but go ahead.
Okay, let's move. We'll go right into funding. So without dedicated funding, we're unable to plan or look ahead and find ourselves in a state of reactive firefighting. The province of British Columbia has taken a leadership role in starting the Watershed Security Fund with an initial endowment of $100 million. The Watershed Security Coalition, of which the BCWF is a member, believes with $400 million from the province and $400 million from the Government of Canada, we can secure an additional $200 million to create a $1 billion fund. This fund can be supplemented annually via water rent.
Sorry, I've got to stop. It's not working? Okay, sorry, we're going to have to go to questions, and we'll see what happens if a question is directed your way, Mr. Zeman. So we'll start. We'll do a 6-minute round, starting with Mr. Cram.
So, Mr. Chair, my questions were actually for Mr. Zeman. I wonder if we could maybe spend a few more minutes troubleshooting the technical details and come back to me after at the end of the round. Would that be doable? Okay.
We'll go with Ms. Taylor-Roy then. Yeah. Okay. Ms. Taylor-Roy for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And it's such a large field that it's really difficult to know where to begin, so I'll begin at home. And that is with an example of a lake in my riding that affects my riding, the watershed anyway, Lake Simcoe. And my question is really about the collaborative work between provincial to territorial and federal governments in addressing freshwater pollution. Because Lake Simcoe is affected by many things, but one of them is continued development, the building of highways close to the lake itself, which has resulted in many, many threats to the lake from the development, which I won't go into the detail of. But really my question is about how, as a federal government, even through the new Freshwater Action Plan and Freshwater Agency, are we able to protect these important freshwater sources when governments, other levels of government, may exempt them from projects from environmental assessments or may proceed, and where we have no jurisdiction to say, to look at something and really to evaluate whether what's being done is going to have a deleterious effect on the water quality in particular. And I was just wondering, perhaps, maybe we can start with Alexandra. You're in the room here, and if you can give me some thoughts on that.
Oui, absolument.
Absolutely. You're quite right. This is a very relevant question. I think that we have to look at water jurisdiction as being fluid, not to make a pun on words, but I think that when you talk about watersheds, well, there's the Mackenzie River that has a huge, covers a huge area. So look at fishing, navigation, which also comes under federal jurisdiction. And also it overlaps with provincial jurisdictions when we talk about First Nations as well. So given this collaboration is very important, because regardless of where the water is, it has a strong impact on us. And the role of the federal government in this situation is to initiate cooperation. It's to implement the tools that we need in order to provide a safety net, so that we find ourselves in a situation where we can no longer manage the water because, politically speaking, we don't have the structure to do it. So I think we need to have some type of guardrails put into place, interjurisdictionally speaking, and we have to also bear in mind provincial issues as well.
Thank you. If I can just follow up with that. So the project, one particular project in my community, is something called the Bradford Bypass. It's a proposed 16.2 kilometer long road. And it's going to cause a lot of runoff. There's going to be effects of climate change. It's going through wetlands, many other things. And with this, it's been determined, especially with the latest ruling on the impact assessment board, that the federal government cannot look at the project to protect the waters of Lake Simcoe, even though that is something which we are talking about in the Water Agency. So it's really, I understand the idea of cooperation, but it requires both levels of government to cooperate. So do you think there is legislation or something else needed? You talked about water as its own entity or having its own rights. Do you believe something else is needed so that the federal government can, in fact, protect these very important sources of fresh water for communities when provincial governments are not doing so?
I think that one of the issues that is most relevant to this is that we have to look at water management in other situations where we can think about water protection in itself. I think that the problem lies in the fact that we have different entryways dealing with water rather than having a holistic approach where could we have more adequate tools, if I understand your question correctly, perhaps. The whole issue of water, well, the simple fact that we view water as an entity in itself, as a stakeholder, that protects us in some respects. It enables us to deal more closely with the environment. There are jurisdictional issues. There's a question of time involved as well. And this takes time to develop strategies. But we have to change our outlook. We have to change our perspective because where we are right now, we realize that it's not working. And so I think the tools such as that will enable us to take some radical change, move ahead. Will that force political cooperation? I don't know. It depends on the type of tool that's developed. But I think that this is in the spirit of federal cooperation. Imposing tools is always complicated. Now we'll turn to Ms. Posey. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for coming. I think that everyone stated that there were new issues involved here, problems that have been amplified given the climate change urgency that we are now experiencing. We have 6 minutes to ask questions. So, Professor Lilo, if you can't provide a complete answer, please feel free to send your notes to the clerk. A lot of experts have told us that implementing strategies with respect to water takes a concrete anchoring. We're talking about the physical proximity and the uses of resources in our ecosystems. So that's the way I've understood it. Do you feel that centralization would be negative in terms of water management? If other levels of government have already put into place their own strategies. Thank you for your question, which is very relevant and important. I think that the two things are not mutually exclusive in the sense that we have to distinguish the jurisdictional tools and the impacts of these policies. The more we act locally, well, we have to look at local interests and also tie it into the question that was asked by the other MP. If we're in a situation, does the water cross the border? We have to be able to have a common vision, an overall vision. And in my opinion, the legal strategy has to be able to enable to deal with these cases. Case by case is good, but we have to look at a strategy, and but the strategy has to be adaptable. And when we look at the water issue, we know obviously the water is going to have an interjurisdictional impact. we look at Montreal and the way that the impact of wastewater there. Yes, it was local, but it had an impact because it crossed borders as well. So we have to ensure that we have. So, Mr. Lilo, we have to prevent the problems from occurring. And that we have to look at the quality of resources. Canada has a responsibility to have an efficient policy, but what about pollution caused by pesticides that was alluded to earlier? This worries a lot of observers because governments announce their intentions, but we have to do things differently because the impact is so strong. What do you think of that? I think today there is a difference between dealing with a problem that's already existing, such as the problem with pesticides, and a strategy that enables us to view things differently, managing consequences. Yes, we do have pesticides in the water. So we have to look at the technical solution to clean up the water. I'm not an expert in that. However, but what I can tell you, at least this is what I think, today the legal framework for managing water does not enable us to take all these initiatives because there are 3 departments provincially that deal with, or maybe 4 federal departments that deal with a particular issue, and we work in silos. And yes, indeed, when we began this study, we could see that there were about 20 departments that looked after water. That doesn't make sense. But how could a Canada Water Agency deal with this problem? Perhaps there's a lack of political will here because we saw that with the PMI, people were resigning. They said that they didn't have proper documentation. It was a nightmare. So how can the Canada Water Agency resolve these issues? Well, it's all. There has to be political will so that the agency can work. Unfortunately, we have to always deal with this political will in order to get things done. And I think that unfortunately this agency will have to reflect certain principles and values. Cooperation will help us to act more quickly than lately. We have to be able to do that. And in your opinion, the Canada Water Agency should have all the tools, legislative tools that it needs to deal with this issue? A quick answer, please, because we always look at the provincial jurisdictions, especially Quebec. What do you think? The Canada Water Agency, we see this as something that's too centralizing, and it may not jive with the political jurisdictions of Quebec. I think that managing the water system does require some centralization in order to get it off the ground. But when it comes to policies, I think it could be more regional in nature. So we could get an agency that is fluid, and it could also get involved locally. Whether it's a hub or regulatory body, that's the issue. And that's where we have to deal with it. But I don't think that the two things are contradictory. I don't want it to be necessarily just a regulatory agency. But now we'll turn the floor, and we will try one last time with Mr. Zeman. Mr. Zeman, are you there?
Last try, and
I am. We can try again. We've been ITing and everything seems to look good. They're telling me it should work.
So could you take a couple of minutes to finish your opening statement?
Okay. We can continue on to questions if you want.
So you don't feel you need to another 2 minutes to finish the opening statement. We can go to questions. I think Mr. Cram has some questions for you anyway. So.
Okay, well, very good, Mr. Zeman. I'm glad that we have resolved these technical issues. So I understand that invasive species are a significant issue for Canadian fishers, especially in British Columbia. I was wondering if you could comment on your views on invasive species and how that is affecting what you do.
Sorry, before you start, Mr. Zeman, can you bring the boom down a little more, closer to your mouth? Yeah, there we go. We'll try
How's that? Yeah, certainly, and I'm sure Wyatt can speak to this as well. Invasive mussels, we're one of the few jurisdictions as it relates to invasive species and disease. British Columbia currently does not have chronic wasting disease in wildlife, and it currently does not have any quagga or zebra mussels. And so the threat in terms of the impact onto fish, fisheries, water systems, and also infrastructure related to water is worth millions of dollars a year if they end up in BC. I think strategically this is one of those issues where we opened up Pandora's box, and instead of dealing with it federally at a local level when it first emerged, we kind of let things take place. And now in British Columbia, we're doing our best to manage it, but certainly federal funding and dedicated funding is a big topic today, where we need to be protecting our borders here in British Columbia to ensure that we don't end up with mussels. It kind of feels like it's just a matter of time here before we end up with a positive.
And so the issue of invasive species was the subject of a report by the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development back in 2019. And the report found that Fisheries and Oceans Canada and the Canada Border Service Agency had not taken the steps required to prevent invasive species from becoming established in Canada's waters, despite commitments to do so. So I was wondering if those findings match your experience in British Columbia. Are there steps being taken to stop invasive species at the border, or what has been done over the last 4 years to change this situation?
Yeah, a lot of it, and you would have heard from Okanagan Basin Water Board, I mean, a lot of it in our world is really a matter of policing our borders and making sure that boats are clean before they enter British Columbia, and that's a funding issue. And again, I'll go back to the Watershed Sustainability Fund, Security Fund that British Columbia has started in on, where they've come up with $100 million to start. That needs to be a $1 billion fund. So I guess in our neck of the woods, the big thing out of the Government of Canada is going to be regulation, enforcement of that regulation, which is an ongoing challenge for us. And then the third piece is having dedicated funding so that we can go out and take care of our borders as it relates to invasive species.
And so that same report found that the government was not tracking which invasive species were of most concern. So just based on your experience, what are the invasive species that are of the most concern from your perspective?
Yeah, it's as it relates to water, it's quagga and zebra mussels for sure. That's the one that is at the top of everyone's mind right now. I would say there's other issues where we have crabs in the ocean, invasive crabs, but right now quagga and zebra mussels are what we live and breathe here every day.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And with my time remaining, I would like to hand it over to my colleague, Dan Mazier.
Thank you, Michael. Mr. Chair, I move the following motion. That pursuant to the order of reference.
Mr. Mazier has the floor. Then I've got Mr. Van Koeverden, Mr. Deltel. Just a second. Let me write this down so I don't. And Ms. Taylor. So we're going to stop. We're going to stop for a moment. Okay, we've got Mr. Mazier, Van Koeverden. Who else? Then it was Deltel, and then Ms. Taylor Roy, I believe. Mr. Ali has his hand. And then Mr. Ali. Okay. Okay, Mr. Mazier, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, that I move the following motion. That pursuant to the order of reference of Thursday, November 9th, 2023, the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change appear before the committee for no fewer than 2 hours to consider supplementary estimates B before Friday, December 1st, 2023. Mr. Chair, the minister needs to testify on the estimates that fund his failed policies.
Can I interrupt for a second? Give some information to the committee, then I'll let you go. This Tuesday he couldn't come because his cabinet. Then Thursday he's going to the Senate committee, and then next Tuesday it's cabinet, and then he's off to COP, whatever it is, 28, and he wants to come, but he can't. He won't be back in the country until December 15th. So I just wanted to give you some background. It's not that he doesn't want to appear. It's a scheduling conflict. But go ahead.
Thank you. So the minister does need to testify. We've asked for him before here to testify basically on his failed environmental policies. He was supposed to be at this committee this week. We now know that he's not going to be here upon numerous requests. And so it is very clear that the minister is hiding from Canadians. And it's very clear why he is hiding from Canadians. On October 13th, the Supreme Court of Canada...
I'm sorry, you just explained why the minister is not coming, and the member opposite is clearly stating.
Well, he has the floor. He can.
Isn't that misinformation that he's saying that he's
it's
clearly avoiding the committee when you
guess,
just explained there's a scheduling conflict?
Yeah, I guess he can. Mr. Mazur is free to doubt the veracity of what I've just said, and impugn my motives. But so he's free to speak. He's free to speak. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. We now know today that he is not going to appear today amongst numerous calls to this committee to appear this week to the committee to become accountable. So it is very clear that Minister Guilbeault is hiding from Canadians. And it's very clear why he's hiding from Canadians. On October 13th, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that the Liberals' No More Pipelines Bill, Bill C-69, was unconstitutional. On October 26th, Minister Guilbeault was forced to backtrack on his failed carbon tax. He admitted that it was unaffordable for Canadians. On November 7th, the government's own Environment Commissioner stated that Minister Guilbeault is failing to meet the government's own emissions targets. On November 14th, the federal court ruled that Minister Guilbeault's plastic ban was unreasonable and unconstitutional.
Another point of order, yes, Madam.
It's more of a point of clarification. We're discussing the motion put forward by Mr. Messier that says that pursuant to the order of reference of Thursday, November 9th, 2023, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change appear before the committee for no fewer than 2 hours to consider the supplementary estimates before Friday, December 1st, 2023. That's what we're discussing. Mr. Chair. I can call this a point of order or whatever you want. It's not a point. It has to be a point of, okay, it's a point of order or a question of privilege. We have witnesses here. Mr. Lilo, who came from Montreal, and now they've traveled to come here. Can't we just ask them questions? Yes, but we're debating Mr. Mazur's motion. Pardon. We'll go back to you, Mr. Mazur.
So it is very clear why the minister is hiding and it doesn't want to testify in front of this committee. On October 13th, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that the Liberals' No More Pipelines Bill, Bill C-69, was unconstitutional. On October 26th, Minister Guilbeault was forced to backtrack on his failed carbon tax. He finally admitted that it was unaffordable for Canadians. On November 7th, the government's own Environment Commissioner stated that Minister Guilbeault is failing to meet the government's own emissions targets. And on November 14th, the federal court ruled that Minister Guilbeault's plastics ban was unreasonable and unconstitutional. No wonder he is hiding. Now I expect the Liberals and the NDP will help cover up the minister's tracks again in stopping this debate on my motion. But Conservatives do believe that Canadians do deserve answers from this minister. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This has become like a little bit of a trend now that we interrupt studies and our witnesses who have joined and in some cases have gone through great tribulations to be able to present and answer questions. We have committee business following this. That is a perfect time to deal with this motion. I appreciate Mr. Mazur bringing it. But with that said, I move to adjourn debate on this so that we can return to the study and work on committee business in the time allotted.
And that's a dilatory motion? No debate, I guess? That's right. Okay, so we'll go to a vote.
Mr. Ali?
Yes.
Madame Chatel? Mr. Longfield?
Yes.
Ms. Taylor-Roy?
Yes.
Mr. Vancouverton?
Yes.
Monsieur Dadtel?
No.
Mr. Cram?
Opposed.
Mr. Leslie?
Opposed.
Mr. Mazur?
Opposed.
Madame Posey?
Oui.
And Mr. Backrack?
Yes.
7 yeas, 4 nays.
Okay, so we go back to the meeting. Yes. Sorry, we go back to, it was Mr. Cram, eh? Yeah, you've got 2 minutes left.
2 minutes left. Okay, very good. So back to Mr. Zeman from the Wildlife Federation of British Columbia. So, Mr. Zeman, on your website, you have a considerable number of recommendations for the Government of Canada in terms of next steps for water policy. Could you give us a brief summary of what the next steps should be?
There's a lot there and not enough time in committee to unpack all of it. I would say, the biggest priority in our world is definitely going to be dedicated funding. That is something that we're continually seeing kind of these wild swings in funding. It doesn't enable us to plan. It doesn't enable us to forecast. Quite frankly, we are often firefighting and living in crisis management rather than proactively addressing all of these issues. Summer in British Columbia, even to now, we're still in drought here in a number of parts. Addressing those things ahead of time proactively is probably the best step. The other piece under that we didn't have a chance to talk to is around regulation and enforcement of regulation. Recently, the UVic Environmental Law Clinic put together a report for the Yakanuki First Nations and the BC Wildlife Federation related to the harmful alteration of fish habitat through hydroelectric development. Permits or authorizations are supposed to be given by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans if we're going to allow hydroelectric developers to impact fish habitat. And what we found in that case was no permits had been issued. So in essence, we're asking the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to follow its own rules to bring BC Hydro and Fortis into compliance. So I would say those are two of the top. We already have existing regulations and legislation which don't have enforcement or not being used. But in our world of British Columbia, we would definitely love to see the Government of Canada step up with $400 million for the Watershed Security Fund.
Okay, time's up. We have 6 minutes exactly till noon. So, Mr. Backrack, you're just going to fit in under the wire.
Just going to fit in under the wire. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah. I appreciate it. And thanks to all of our witnesses for their testimony so far. I'd like to pick up where Mr. Zeman left off with his request that the federal government invest $400 million in the BC Watershed Security Fund. And perhaps he could just lay out what the British Columbia government has invested to date and some of the activities that this would facilitate if the federal government stepped up and enabled a $1 billion watershed security fund in our province.
Yeah, absolutely. The province this spring announced $100 million to get the fund going. We'd like to see another $300 million out of the province to help federally and provincially bring it up to $1 billion. What has it enabled? It's enabled fish habitat restoration, wetlands restoration. It's enabled a bunch of planning, co-governance, partnerships with First Nations, all of these things that we need to take care of our watersheds and our fish. It also has drawn in a whole bunch of local community support, and that's something that our organization and other organizations in British Columbia, such as Ducks Unlimited, are fairly good at. And it's also, I think, brought communities closer together. It's helped support reconciliation between First Nations, Indigenous communities, and non-First Nations communities. So there's a whole bunch of really good value-added stuff. It's also going to help mitigate the effects of climate change. A bunch of the infrastructure we've invested in around beaver dam analogs and riparian area, habitat restoration, wetlands restoration, just generally good stuff for wetlands, for watersheds, but also from preventing or mitigating the effects of climate change.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Zeman. And based on that, Mr. Chair, I would like to put on notice the following motion: that given the importance of freshwater ecosystem services to the prosperity, sustainability, and resilience of British Columbian communities, and given the increasingly severe impacts of climate change, including drought, wildfires, and floods, the committee urged the federal government to work with the government of British Columbia to build a $1 billion watershed security fund. And I'll provide a written version in both languages to the clerk as soon as possible. But I wanted to notify the committee that I'll be putting that motion on notice. Thank you.
Are you going to continue with your question?
Continuing with my question.
Yeah, because it's
you
have 3 minutes left because we have to stop at noon.
I know,
Yeah,
and I
okay,
appreciate all three of those minutes. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Moving to Mr. Patrician. Mr. Patrician, you laid out a long history of water pollution challenges in the Elk Valley, and it seems that despite knowing about this problem for decades and decades, there's been very little progress in addressing the root cause of the problem. What are some of the key systemic barriers to or impediments to resolving those water pollution issues in your view?
Yeah, thanks for the question. The history in the Elk Valley is quite complicated, as many you know, and it's been going on for a very long time. So there's a lot of legacy issues that are embedded within the Elk Valley. But over the past couple of decades, the issues with the contamination, especially from selenium, have become more and more aware. And there's just been this continued reluctance to actually take meaningful action. Some of the witnesses have already spoken to this, but there's typically been a reluctance to impose meaningful fines to require companies to come into compliance. And this is something that's occurred in the Elk Valley for decades. The federal government has taken a positive shift, I think, for that $60 million fine that was given a couple of years ago. But if that action was taken earlier, I think a lot more would have been done to actually mitigate this issue. Another issue is the asymmetrical nature in which decisions have been made. Typically, in regards to mitigation and even restoration work, this is done by the company, and it's typically in line with their bottom dollar. A more whole ecosystem approach and an approach that encompasses all different communities and governments, First Nations, would be a more prudent path forward to make sure that the entire well-being of that ecosystem is maintained in the future and not just the short term.
Patricia, now of course the Elk Valley is only one of the coal-producing regions of Canada. In the area where I live, the Bulkley Valley, there's a proposal for an open-pit coal mine near the Telkwa River in the Skeena watershed. This is a watershed that supports a world-renowned steelhead run, as well as all 5 species of wild salmon. And I'm wondering what advice you would have for the residents of the Bulkley Valley and the Skeena watershed who are grappling with this proposal, which would result in the mining of 750,000 to 825,000 tons of coal per year over 25 years. Does the Elk Valley provide a cautionary tale? And what advice would you give to the people of the Skeena watershed based on your experience in the Elk Valley?
Fairly briefly, if you can, please.
Definitely. Yeah, I think it is a precautionary tale. I think in many respects, a lot of folks didn't know some of the implications of coal mining. And again, it's been going on for over 100 years in the Elk Valley. In regards to the potential mine in your area, I think making sure people are fully aware of potential consequences from beginning one of these mines and how those short-term economic benefits might play out to these long-term economic costs. And there's many examples of coal mines mines in British Columbia that have shut down and where remediation has fallen onto taxpayers.
Thank you.
It's cost them millions of dollars.
Thanks very much. We're going to stop there. I want to thank all the witnesses. I apologize for some of the interruptions, but it's all fair game in our system. And we'll now go on to the second panel. But first we have to test the panelists who are online again. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Professeur Lido, d'être ici en personne.
Thank you, Professor Lilo, for coming here in person. I have a question for Mr. Zeman. Could you please send us your brief, the brief that you were reading? And we're going to have it translated and distributed to committee members, and that will help us with our report. Thank you very much.
ready for our second panel. Before we start, the only pressing item of committee business really to do, and I don't think we need to go on camera for this, is to adopt the budget for the water study. So okay, everyone's in agreement with adopting the budget? Okay, so we won't do committee business at 10 to 1. We won't do any committee business in camera today. We'll do that on Thursday from 1 to 1:30. And we can go then, this will allow us to proceed with our witnesses till 1 o'clock. Okay, thank you, colleagues. I appreciate the cooperation. We have with us Mr. Robert Sopak, former parliamentarian. Nice to see you today. We have Andrew Stegeman from Our Living Waters. We have from the Canadian Environmental Law Association, Deborah Curran, and from the Conseil Régional de l'Environnement de l'Estrie, nous avons Monsieur David O'Connell.
We have Mr. David O'Connell from the Regional Environmental Council of Estrie.
Un maximum de 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hope my sound is coming through well. There's two aspects to fresh water in Canada: water quality and water quantity. Quality relates to the relative purity of water with regards to human use and ecosystem function. Water quantity relates to the amount of water flowing or being used over a period of time. Water can be overabundant due to floods, but scarce during droughts, creating significant water allocation conflicts. Or as Mark Twain once said, whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting over. The most significant water issues are in the settled parts of Canada where most Canadians live and work, sometimes referred to as the southern working landscape. Water in this area is either surface water or groundwater. There was a 2009 report entitled The Sustainable Management of Groundwater in Canada that noted, quote, nearly a third of Canada's population, some 10 million people, depends on groundwater for safe drinking water, and more than 80% of Canada's rural population depends on groundwater. The report noted that, quote, Canada's groundwater, however, is increasingly under threat from factors such as urbanization, climate change, burgeoning energy production, intensification of agriculture, and contamination. This report provides a useful blueprint for the management of Canada's groundwater resources, and I urge the committee to prioritize groundwater issues. Regarding surface water quality, from a human use perspective, water quality is affected by point source and non-point source pollution. Point source pollution is effluent from a single point, such as industrial and urban facilities. However, non-point source pollution is diffuse and results from land runoff, precipitation, land drainage, or hydrological modification. The most prominent result of non-point source pollution is phosphorus runoff into water bodies, often causing algal blooms such as in Lake Erie. Such blooms lead to degraded water quality, fish kills, and can affect local economies. Point source pollution is largely under control or well managed up to a certain point, although I know there's issues still. The 1989 Pulp and Paper Effluent Regulations mandated the treatment of toxic effluents from mills, and almost all cities have wastewater treatment plants. Mitigating non-point source pollution is difficult and requires landscape-level treatments that are expensive, difficult to implement, and may affect local economies. Regarding water quantity, floods and droughts are the main causes of water quantity issues. Canada's infrastructure needs to be hardened against flooding, as was done by the sainted Manitoba Premier Duff Roblin when he built the Winnipeg Floodway. Built between 1962 and 68, the floodway cost $63 million and has saved property damage in the order of $30 billion with a B. Climate change adaptation at its finest. Floodways, dikes, and dams are examples of hard infrastructure, but natural infrastructure means the creation or recreation of lost natural features such as wetlands. This is sometimes referred to as nature-based solutions, a concept I strongly support. A study of the Smith Creek watershed in eastern Saskatchewan estimated that for the 2011 flood, complete restoration of the wetlands to their historic levels decreases the flood peak that year by nearly a third. Conversely, complete drainage of wetlands increased to 2011 peak by 78%. Constructing small dams also has been shown to protect infrastructure. Wetlands, whether natural or constructed, also improve water quality and sequester carbon. I recommend that all publicly funded infrastructure programs include the creation of natural infrastructure and support nature-based solutions in addition to the hard engineering. The best example of drought adaptation is modern agriculture, where new crop varieties and tillage practices conserve water for crops during droughts. Agriculture is a special case since farmed land is privately owned and all of the economic signals incentivize farmers to maximize production. The miracle of modern agriculture is that people on modest incomes, at least until now, were able to eat well. The current vigorous debates on high food prices is instructive. However, farmers are being asked to to conserve the public resources on their private lands, such as wetlands that provide only public benefits and only increase the farmers' costs. Providing incentives to private farmers to deliver non-market public goods will settle this impasse. Public goods include flood control, water quality improvement, biodiversity conservation, and carbon sequestration. This could be very significant since much of the southern working landscape is farmed and in private hands. There are many examples in North America, but one I'm most familiar with is Manitoba's GROW program, which provides financial incentives to producers to conserve wetlands. Alberta has developed a similar approach, but these programs need to be scaled up significantly. Canada has been very late to the game of incentive-based conservation on private lands, and we are behind the US and Europe, where the Farm Bill and the Common Agricultural Policy respectively support large-scale private land conservation as a high priority. I hope that the committee will provide strong recommendations to the government to establish private land conservation programs on a scale similar to the United States and Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sopak, for a very interesting and insightful brief. And thank you for bringing up groundwater, because there's a misconception in Canada that we have a lot of groundwater, but it's under threat from what I've heard. And you've confirmed that. We'll go now to Mr. Stegeman for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and all the members of the committee. My name is Andrew Stegman. I am the former National Director of Our Living Waters, as well as the former Chair of the Canadian Coalition for Healthy Waters. I'm calling from Vancouver, BC, which is on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. When we consider the health of our waters, we often focus on specific problems like managing pollution, but in the absence of a larger consideration of integrated watershed management. But if we're to properly manage pollution in our waters, we have to think like water. To see the point more clearly, consider a body of water in your riding, a river or a lake or a stream you particularly like. The health of that water is, of course, impacted by what happens on the land surrounding it. If contaminants are spilled on the land, it seeps into the water. The health of that water is also impacted by what happens upstream. So, for example, water in the St. Lawrence River flowing past MP Posé's riding is impacted upstream by water in the St. Lawrence, flowing by Montreal and MP Scarpelegia's riding, by water in the Ottawa River flowing by MP Chatel's riding, by water flowing in the Rouge River by MP Taylor Roy's riding, by water in 16 Mile Creek in MP Vancouverden's riding, by water in the Credit River in MP Alley's riding, and by water flowing the Grand River watershed in MP Longfield's riding. And all of that meets up downstream with water flowing out of the St. Charles River through MP Deltel's riding into the St. Lawrence outside Quebec City. In that small example, we've just connected 8 out of 12 members of this committee, 3 political parties, 2 provinces, countless traditional territories of Indigenous peoples, in addition to regional and local governments, not to mention the impact of decisions made by our US neighbors to the south. That's a lot of interconnections. Interconnections that the federal government, with a Canada-wide gaze on these issues, especially needs to consider when thinking about management of pollution or other water health issues in general. With this as background, I have 5 specific recommendations I'd humbly suggest this committee make in its final report. These recommendations mirror the 5 foundational pillars put forward by the Canadian Coalition for Healthy Waters, which consists of over 65 member organizations right across the country, which is currently co-chaired by the Forum for Leadership on Water and the De Gaspé-Beaubien Foundation. Our recommendations should be applied to every aspect of the government's policy and institutional levers, including legislation, regulations, policies, institutions like the Emerging Canada Water Agency, and all government water investments. Number 1, that the Government of Canada meaningfully advance its commitment to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples by developing pathways and providing resources for the co-governance of shared waters with Indigenous nations, including recognizing and upholding inherent Indigenous water rights and authority and fulfilling the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Number 2, that the Government of Canada play a key role in creating and mobilizing the knowledge and tools, both Western and Indigenous, needed to understand, predict, and respond to water challenges and opportunities, particularly against the backdrop of climate change. This includes enhanced funding to amplify existing data collection and dedicated support for community-based water monitoring. Number 3, that the Government of Canada takes steps to strengthen cooperation across this federation around shared water decision-making and management among different levels of government. This includes respecting the jurisdiction of Indigenous nations and peoples, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments and focusing on high-level capacity support while providing leadership and guidance on water management best practices. 4, that the Government of Canada leads through an approach that emphasizes the importance of watershed boundaries in all decision-making. This watershed approach considers interconnected ecological, social, economic, and cultural values that must be balanced to ensure the well-being of communities and ecosystems across our interconnected watersheds. This includes supporting watershed-based collaboration across this country and working to ensure adequate environmental flows to provide enough water to make certain that life thrives. And finally, 5, that the Government of Canada prioritizes renewing outdated federal water laws and policies. The immediate focus should be on renewing the over 50-year-old Canada Water Act in collaboration with provincial, territorial, and Indigenous governments. And further, to ensure that the renewed Canada Water Act is consent-based and rooted in nation-to-nation relationships, that the Act be co-drafted with Indigenous nations. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stegeman. You used a well-worn political tactic, which is to mention as many people as possible. So we'll go now to Ms. Curran.
Thank you. I'm coming to you here in Wasatch Territory and also the Lekwungen speaking peoples. And I just wanted to clarify that I'm with the Environmental Law Center, which is a nonprofit organization working within the Faculty of Law at the University of Victoria. And we deliver a clinic program through which students and staff provide over 6,000 hours of pro bono legal assistance in Canada each year to Indigenous and community organizations. So I'm not with the Canadian Environmental Law Association, as was stated. Over the past decade, clients have engaged with the Environmental Law Center to work on many, many different freshwater issues that are within the jurisdiction of the federal government, and I rely on that work as the basis for this submission. So just to provide some context, you know all about water, so I'm not going to fill you in on anything, but I just want to highlight 2 things that are really driving change in the freshwater sphere and also in relation to laws and policies and their implementation. So the first one is that really the way in which we're going to address these interconnected hydrological problems and issues at a watershed scale is through partnerships with Indigenous communities. And so whether we're seeing unprecedented multi-year droughts or we're seeing the intensification of storm events, it's really in place in watersheds that integrated collaborative management and governance is going to occur. And I can give you some examples where that's happening in British Columbia. The second thing is that, driven by climate change, the actual impacts around water being seen much more intensively, and certainly in the last 4 or 5 years. And so my second point is that really the federal government has a lot of tools already, and my particular expertise is law, so a lot of laws and legal tools on the books that are simply not being used to the extent that they could be to address what the changing conditions that are going on right now. So in particular, I point to the Canada Water Act and a renewal of the Canada Water Act, and also certain provisions of the Fisheries Act. So those are my contextual statements, and then I'll just make 2 points around collaborative governance and then flows, environmental flows, but as they're related to pollution, because the 2 go hand in hand. So we see some interesting court decisions recently here in British Columbia. Courts now recognize that treaty and Aboriginal rights are limiting the way in which state governments make decisions about natural resources development across the landscape. So I'm referring to the Yehi and British Columbia decision from 2021 that found that the cumulative impacts of primarily oil and gas development in the northeast of BC was a treaty infringement of those nations. And we're also seeing at the same time consent-based processes for new mines, water quality, and broader conservation, such as for protected areas. And with the federal funding for meeting the biodiversity targets 30 at 30, there is available a lot of funding to improve on conservation areas. So in terms of collaborative governance, we're really seeing that it is, in many cases, Indigenous communities who are leading the way in partnership with the province and in sometimes with federal funding. And I can point you to, for example, the Gitniao Aksayuk water policy that they have just launched that is based on both Western science and their legal order. And it is a process by which anyone using water in their territory needs to abide. And then I also point you to, and you might have already spoken about this with federal staff, the decades-long monitoring of water quality and quantity by the First Nations in the Peace Athabasca Delta and the federal government's commitment to further work in that area. My final points just relate to both flow and pollution. And so because the way in which we do environmental regulation related to water in Canada is still very much along the principle of dilution is the solution to pollution, as flows change, and I'm particularly pointing to low flows, pollution concentrates. And there has never been meaningful conversation with Indigenous people about what that means for example, the Fraser River and the fish coming up the Fraser River. That is now occurring quite extensively with the nations in the Peace Athabasca Delta related to Wood Buffalo National Park due to a lot of pressure from UNESCO and various other fora. So I just wanted to point out, and I would echo the comments of the panel before us around the pollution from the Elk Valley, the international impacts of that, and the need for the federal government to more fully use its existing legal tools to take an interest in freshwater issues that are of national concern. They're of national scope and concern, not just interjurisdictionally, but into federal lands, affecting fisheries. And the federal government does have a lot of room to act.
Thank you. You mentioned that not all provisions of the Fisheries Act are being used to their fullest or being used at all. Would you mind maybe sending us some examples that are we could distribute to committee members and that the analysts could maybe invoke in the draft report? I will go now to Mr. O'Connor. Allez-y, Monsieur O'Connor.
Bonjour, Monsieur.
Go ahead. Good morning, committee members. Thank you for inviting me here today. I am born here in Ottawa, and I also went to Carleton University, where I discovered my passion. Can you not hear me? Please continue. My name is Dr. David O'Connor. I am a project manager at the Regional Environmental Council of Estrie. I'd just like to clarify that I'm here as an individual, and I don't necessarily represent the opinion of the Regional Environment Council of Estrie or the National Association in Quebec. If you were to ask me why I'm here to talk about exotic invasive species in the context of pollution, it's because there is no pollutant that can have such an impact with such as biological products or organisms. A milliliter of water with contaminated by a zebra mussel or the quadra mussel or spiny water fleas can have a major impact on our waterways and cause a severe decline in other populations. This can have a severe impact on our recreational activities, and it's very important for municipalities when they look at reforming their water infrastructure. If I give you an example, in Lake Magentic, when we had the disaster 10 years ago, there were hundreds and thousands of milliliters of oil products that flowed into the lake. Today, the lake is being rehabilitated. But if we compare that with Temiskaming Lake, where the mussel was introduced, we can see there has been a huge decline in recreational fishing. In the case of, with respect to the role of the federal government, it already plays an important role, and it's important that it looks at what needs to be done when we talk about various agencies, such as Transport Canada. They also issue licenses for boats and for drivers. But when you look at the Great Lakes, there are waterways that have been damaged by the boats that have been the primary source of exotic invasive species. During the course of my work, I am trying to develop a regional strategy to deal with invasive species funded by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And I look at what's happening elsewhere as well in the course of my work. We are 10 to 15 years behind the other jurisdictions. In the case of the states, they have inspections of boats and monitor these boats 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. It's illegal to go through a boating station without being monitored, whether it's a big boat or a kayak. In order to fund these initiatives, you have to pay for a license, and the funding from these, the money that goes into purchasing the license goes to funding the cleaning stations. We are about 5 to 10 years behind the state of New York. They put more than $9 million per year just into their program for people who are getting into the water and boat owners. They check all the boats. It's absolutely essential that the federal government assume its role to help us at the municipal level, in the region area, at the provincial level, so that we can deal with these invasive species. In Estrie alone, we have one of the most contaminated waterways when we look at Champlain Lake. And we have many lakes that cross international borders. So there is a real need that we take more action and at a local level. Thank you very much. That's very fascinating. Thank you, Mr. O'Connor.
Alors, nous passons.
So we will now go to questions. Each party will have a 6-minute round, but I will be a little bit more flexible if I can. If we give every party 7 minutes, that will bring us to the 1 o'clock. So I'll start with Mr. Leslie. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start with Mr. Sopuck. Given that BC Wildlife was here but had some technical difficulties, I know you're an avid hunter and angler. I'm wondering if you can speak to the role that community plays in managing our freshwater resources and how we can go about better recognizing that reality.
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Leslie. What's different about the hunting and angling community in Canada versus everybody else who talks about the environmental conservation is that these people actually get their hands dirty and are out there in the field cleaning up rivers, improving fish habitat, creating wildlife habitat. And they number about 5 million people, and they are always forgotten in these kinds of fora. For example, the Smithsonian Institute in the United States did a major study on bird abundance, and they found the only bird species, group of bird species that are doing well are waterfowl, and they attribute it directly to the work of hunters and anglers. They said the positive actions taken by hunters and anglers who collectively prioritized preserving these species. So there was a group of people who actually went on the ground, got their hands dirty, and I noticed the testimony from the BC Wildlife Federation. Unfortunately, his talk was truncated, but he talked about on-the-ground work that's done. When we were in government, we instituted something called the Recreational Fisheries Conservation Partnerships Program. And over the 3 years that the program ran, there were literally hundreds of projects conducted on freshwater regarding fish habitat, fish population enhancement by Canada's angling groups. It was a remarkable story of community partnerships with government. Unfortunately, and it's a fact, it's not my opinion, when the new government came in, they canceled that program, unfortunately.
Thank you, Mr. Sopak. You mentioned your time in the Harper government. Back in 2012, the previous government amended the Fisheries Act and the Navigable Waters Act. As well, this government, when it came in, made some significant changes to reverse that. Could you explain why those changes were made back in 2005 and your thoughts on the abandoning of those changes that were originally made by the Harper government?
Sure. I did a paper on the Fisheries Act for the Frontier Center for Public Policy way back in 2002. And the Fisheries Act defined habitat extremely broadly. So basically any puddle, any little drainage ditch, it was all considered fish habitat. Secondly, they talked about the factors that not only affected fish, but had the potential to affect fish. So what that did is that made every single water body basically fish habitat. And when the fisheries officers, descended upon rural communities, and of course always carrying sidearms, which we found very strange in a farmer meeting, they were very much quotes, meddling in the private activities of private landowners and their farming activities. And I recall a study that we did at the Fisheries Committee. I was also on the Fisheries Committee for nine years, and we were in opposition at the time. We had a look at the changes we made to the Fisheries Act. And one of the witnesses was a Mr. Ron Bonnet, who at the time, and Mr. Mazur knows him, Mr. Bonnet was president of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. He was scathing in his critique of the DFO having descended on farms. And he said that the enforcement was inconsistent, it didn't work, and actually it inhibited him from actually doing fish habitat programs. The other reason we changed the Fisheries Act is that we wanted to focus actually on fish. Fish habitat is supposed to produce fish. And so we focused on fish production. Regarding the Navigable Waters Protection Act, it was a similar kind of thing to the Fisheries Act. Every little water body that could float a canoe was considered navigable. The act was promulgated in the 1800s when water navigation was prominent and important in Canada. It has become much less so because of rail and trucking. So what we did at the time, we created the Navigation Protection Act, the point being to protect navigation on those waters that are actually being used for commercial navigation.
Switching gears again a little bit here, and I'll ask you to answer in about a minute if you can. You mentioned the Duff Roblin, the work that he did in Manitoba, and I know you seem to indicate that you favor that adaptation and mitigation approach to tackling climate change and the impacts of, rather than implementing taxes to try to resolve the problem. Could you expand on why you take that approach?
Sure. I've yet to have anybody explain to me how a carbon tax in Canada will affect anything that happens in Canada in terms of droughts, floods, and all those kinds of things. And again, we're all entitled to our own opinions, but not our own facts. And the fact that Canada emits 1.5% of global CO2 means not much that we do in Canada will have any effect either on the global climate or on Canada in general. Where we can make a significant impact is through adaptation and mitigation, protecting our natural heritage, our great forests and grasslands as carbon sinks is critically important. And that's why I talked about natural infrastructure. In terms of hard infrastructure, what Duff Roblin did, we didn't call it climate change back then, but the miracle of the Winnipeg floodway and the associated flood control works has saved Winnipeg many times over. One last point I want to make about the federal government. We're trying to build the Lake.
Sopak, I apologize. I just need to cut you off there, Mr. Sopak, because, Mr. Chair, I would like to take this opportunity to move a motion that is extremely...
I'd like to speak on that.
It's extremely relevant to what is happening right now as it relates to a rally happening at Centennial Flame where they will be marching to the Senate to protest the unprecedented political game. So as per the notice I put on motion last week, I would like to move that given that, A, Canadian farmers have some of the most environmentally friendly agricultural operations in the world. B, the premiers of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick have issued public letters calling on the Senate to urgently pass Bill C-234, a carbon tax carve-out for farmers. C, Bill C-234 will provide relief for farmers struggling with the burden of the government's carbon tax. And D, Bill C-234 will help lower food prices for all Canadians across the country. The committee calls on the Senate of Canada to pass Bill C-234, a carbon tax carve-out for farmers, as soon as possible and report this to the House of Commons. Now, Mr. Chair, I do want to keep my comments on this brief, but this is extremely important legislation. This is $1 billion coming out of the pockets of farmers over the next 7 years, or money that could be left in the pockets of farmers. Now, the minister had previously in the media falsely stated that 97% of on-farm emissions are exempt. He had to walk that statement back through a communications advisor. But the reason of what he was alluding to is that diesel and marked gasoline were exempted originally from the carbon tax.
Point
and
of
this
order,
was
Mr. Chair.
due to the fact.
We have a point of order. But before we go to the point of order, I would just like to say, this was to the witnesses, really, because we're inconveniencing the witnesses. I must say, this has been one of the most interesting conversations that I've heard during this study. So thank you for your participation to date. But we'll go to who called the point of order? You did, yeah. Go ahead.
My point of order is to question the relevance of the.
Okay. Well, the relevance. Well, I don't think it has to be relevant. They have a right to table the motion. They have a right to. Anybody has a right to table a motion and speak to it. But anyway, go ahead, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will tell you the relevance. Right now, there are people outside of the Centennial Flame about to walk down to the Senate to tell senators to pass this bill. The relevance is this is happening right now. As I was saying regarding the reason for
Excuse me. Yeah, go ahead.
So we have Mr. Leslie, then Mr. Vancouver, and then Madame Posey, and okay. So is that yours? A point of order as well?
It's a point of privilege.
Oh boy. Okay. So I think Madame, I think Madame Châtel was first. We'll go with her point of order, and then your point of privilege.
Mr. Chair, there's 2 women senators that have been threatened. And my colleague is just repeating that threat on them. I'm really concerned. What are you doing? What are you doing to women? This is unacceptable.
May I speak to that, Mr. Chair?
No, we'll go to the point of privilege.
Thank you. It was very similar. I just want to say now you're telling, first it was bullying online and pointing out the women members of the Independent Senate group when there are also many male members of that Independent Senate group. And there's been threats made to these women. And now you have a march descending on the Senate to tell them to do something? What happened to our government? What happened to procedure and law and order and respect for members of the Senate and of the House of Commons? This is like some kind of a tin pot dictatorship or something. Like you don't like what's happening, so we bring out the crowds. Sounds like the convoy again.
Okay, thank you. We'll go back to Ms.
Non, mais il me rappelle au règlement.
On a point of order? Yes. This is interesting. Something's happening. I even had an amendment to the motion. However, I'll go back to what we were saying earlier. We have witnesses here online. We have a witness here in presence. They've traveled, and I think we need to make a decision. But I don't know how we debate. Adjourn this debate. Do I have to do a motion or? I will allow Mr. Leslie to conclude, and then we will give the floor to Mr. Vancouverden. And then it will be your turn to speak, Ms. Posey, but inaudible. Mr. Mazer would be after.
well, we've done this before, where I didn't see it. I didn't see it. Yeah, but she's not the chair.
You got two lists. I'm done.
Yeah, but last time, just in terms of precedence, Mr. Deltel said the same thing, that he was on the clerk's list, but I didn't see him and I didn't let him speak. So I want to be consistent.
Okay.
But anyway, listen. I'd like to ask if the witnesses would be willing to come back on another occasion. No, I understand that's not
Chair,
fair.
that's not fair to the witnesses.
If we deal with this.
Okay, well, I'm saying if we can't deal with it, but Mr. Leslie, go ahead. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would just highlight that the interruptions and point of orders have taken much more time than I was planning on speaking to this. And I am unaware of any threats to any senators. I, of course, in no way would ever condone physical harassment or threats, and it certainly did not come from me. And when I speak about a march, that is a typical protest that happens in front of Parliament Hill every day. It is not a threatening march to go attack senators. However, the reason that people are here angry is because this chamber, the House of Commons, passed a piece of legislation that would solve an affordability crisis for Canadians and would help farmers deal with increasing costs. The reality is, natural gas and propane for grain drying and heating and cooling of barns should have been exempted originally. Had the government been more aware of farming operations, just like they did diesel and dyed fuel, they would have exempted that to begin with. We had a chance. We have a chance. The reason that this chamber passed Bill C-234 was with the support of the NDP, Liberals, Conservatives, Bloc Québécois, Greens, and some Liberals. And, Mr. Chair, these are thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars of costs that go directly to the bottom, against the bottom line of Canadian farmers. And what that does is both ensure that their families have less prosperity and they're able to not support their community in the same way. But more importantly, as it relates to the environmental implications, farmers are not able to reinvest into new technologies, new practices, and new equipment to actually improve environmental outcomes. Now, this issue, unfortunately, has become political. It was really not meant to be political, and that's why we saw such cross-partisan support for Bill C-234. And it became political when the Prime Minister decided that 3% of Canadians were going to receive a break on the carbon tax on home heating, stepping back on a major marquee policy. But this legislation is about doing the right thing for Canadian farmers, doing the right things for Canadian consumers, and passing this legislation. The Senate is absolutely playing shenanigans with this legislation. The point of the carbon tax, I understand as to what it is trying to use. It's trying to use market dynamics. In the case of these practices, much like operating a tractor or a combine on a field, there are simply no alternatives available. And lastly, Mr. Speaker or Mr. Chair, I would just say this is unheard of in the Senate, to do this to a private member's bill. And I would just urge all members of Parliament to consider, if this was your private member's bill that was making its way through the House of Commons, effectively passed through the democratically elected chamber, only to be delayed by the unelected Senate, I would think that you would be very opposed to the Senate playing these games.
Interrupt you, I'll come back to you. Madame Chatel, point of order.
Oui, 2 points.
2 points. What is the speaker's list? And can I ask my colleague to proceed a little bit more quickly? I don't know where we are in the list. How many minutes? One moment, please. I think I stopped the timer. Or stop the clock. Yeah. 6 minutes. So the Conservatives are out of time. And that was your point of order, Ms. Chatel? I just wanted to know about the speaker's orders. Oh, so I misunderstood. So it's Mr. Van Couverden, Madame Posey, Mr. Mazier, Mr. Ali, and Ms. Taylor-Roy to answer your question.
Back to Mr. Leslie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was almost concluded. I have no more to say other than this is the right thing. The Senate needs to get out of the way. We should be adding our voice as parliamentarians, as members of the House of Commons, duly elected, that supported this legislation, and call on the Senate to do the right thing, pass this legislation unamended immediately so we can give $1 billion break to Canadian hardworking farmers. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Mr. Van Koerden.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
I am next.
You want to vote?
I challenge the chair on the speaking order.
Okay.
So we have to have a vote on it?
Yeah, I guess. So I guess.
I turned on my mic, Dan. Like you heard it. I turned on my
Calling
mic.
for a vote on the, I'm challenging
Go
the
for
chair
it.
on the speaking
Go for
order.
it.
Anyway, it's
Go for
okay.
it.
Challenging
Vote
the
on
chair
it.
on the speaking
Okay.
order.
Just
You know
a
you're
second.
wrong.
Well within my
Okay.
right.
Go for it.
Just a second.
So the speaking order is?
Please turn off Mr. Leslie's microphone, please.
Okay, so Mr. Mazer has a right to.
Monsieur Mézières peut contester la liste d'intervenants du président. Si on remet en question la décision du président concernant les intervenants, quel sera à ce moment-là l'ordre de prise de parole? Est-ce qu'on doit présenter une motion? Une chose à la fois, s'il vous plaît. Donc, pouvez-vous répéter, Monsieur Mézières, vous contestez la liste d'intervenants parce que vous croyez que vous devriez être le prochain à prendre la parole. Vous savez, oups.
Okay, maybe it's a question of did you choose the right channel? Okay. Go ahead. We'll vote on Mr. Mazer's challenge of the speaking order.
Let's challenge on your ruling.
On my ruling, sorry, regarding the speaking order.
Answer my question about what happens if the speaking
No,
order
because
is,
I don't
You don't know the
I don't have
answer.
the answer right now.
Could
So
we confer with the clerk and maybe recess for a few minutes and then come back?
is it that we have to vote? I think we have to vote.
Oh, we have to vote. Well, okay. I guess we'll see then.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. We'll take it one step at a time. But go ahead.
We're in uncharted, unnavigable waters.
Navigable waters, yeah.
So Mr. Ali,
Against.
Madame Chatel,
So is the question, shall the chair be sustained?
No, wait a minute. Let's be clear on this. No, Mr. Mazier is challenging. So the question is, I guess, do you agree with Mr. Mazier?
exactly.
Do you agree with Mr. Mazier and you don't? Yeah, but in regards to the speaking order, do you agree with Mr. Mazier in regards to the speaking order? Mr. Ali says no. Go ahead, please, for the others.
Madame Chatel,
I disagree with Mr. Mazier.
Mr. Longfield, no. Ms. Taylor-Roy,
No.
Mr. Van Koeverden,
No.
Monsieur Datel,
Oh.
Mr. Krem,
In favor.
Mr. Leslie, Mr. Mazier,
I agree myself.
Madame Posey,
No.
Mr. Backrack.
Okay, so we go back to Mr. Leslie for concluding comments. Oh, sorry, Mr. Now, yeah, then you'd be right to challenge, Mr. Van Koeverden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Once again, the Conservatives have decided to disrupt this study twice in 2 hours. They might not care about the perspectives of experts, since the expertise of these scientists doesn't necessarily align with their conservative oil and gas fueled misinformation campaign that they continue to perpetuate. Mr. Sopuck, you could turn off your mic.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
I'll start over. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Once again, the Conservatives have decided to disrupt this study twice in 2 hours. They might not care about the perspectives of experts, since their expertise of these scientists does not align with the conservative oil and gas fueled misinformation campaign that they continue to perpetuate. These disruptions are not only unproductive, undemocratic, and intentionally theatrical, they're also rude to our witnesses and a complete waste of our resources as a committee and the valuable time of our expert panelists. This is actually an abuse of our privileges and rights as elected people. We have an obligation to utilize this privilege in an ethical and democratic manner. This committee is not your personal theater. Shame on you. For that reason,
Vancouverton, I have a point of order.
Yeah.
It's very theatrical the way he's speaking about the theatrics, which I find a little bit ironic.
Point of order.
Sorry, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Mr. Vancouverton, you may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For that reason, I implore my Conservative colleagues to respect this committee, and I move to...
Point of order?
I don't care about the clip, Dan.
You don't care again.
No,
about the clip.
no,
I called you out on that last time.
There has to be a point of order, or we go back to Mr. Vancouverton.
Obviously, it's well within our right. They keep on challenging us as far as
It's debate.
No, but this is debate. He can.
So the point of order is it's well within our right.
Is Mr. Vancouverton using unparliamentary language?
I don't know.
Well, that would be a point of order. So that's not what you're suggesting.
Relevant.
Well, that's
a committee.
No, I haven't said that.
Anyway, go ahead.
I'll say it again. This committee is not your personal
read it
theater.
again.
Shame on you. For that reason, I implore my
Point of order,
Conservative
Mr. Chair.
colleagues to
Point of
respect
order.
this
Now,
committee.
excuse me, another point of order. It better be a point
Yes.
of order. Though.
Yes, I believe that all statements are to be addressed through the chair. I wonder if Mr. Vancouver is saying shame on you, the chair, or who exactly is he referring to when he
Can you
says shame
clarify
on you?
that, Mr. Vancouver?
Shall I start again?
Yes.
Just, I want you to clarify that you're
I'll
not.
try to reduce the theatrics for Mr. Leslie. Once again, these Conservatives have decided to disrupt this study. Twice in 2 hours, they may not care about the perspectives of experts who have come to this committee to testify, since that expertise and that of these scientists does not necessarily align with a Conservative oil and gas fueled misinformation campaign that they continue to perpetuate. These disruptions are not only unproductive and undemocratic and
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Okay.
Undemocratic? Can you tell me, Mr. Speaker, undemocratic? Well, I'm here, Mr. Speaker, you, me, everybody here has been elected. This is democracy moving. Everybody can use it as they want to. But the point is that I'm sorry, but my team is not undemocratic.
I do understand. Mr. Vancouverton, the floor is yours.
These disruptions are not just unproductive, undemocratic, and intentionally theatrical, they're also rude and a waste of our resources as a committee and the valuable time of our expert panels. This is actually an abuse of our privileges and rights as elected people. We have an obligation to utilize this privilege in an ethical and democratic manner. This committee is not a personal theater. Shame on those who use it as such. For that reason, I implore my Conservative colleagues to respect this committee, and I move to adjourn debate until we get to committee business, which is the appropriate time for these types of motions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I missed I was speaking to the. Okay, move to adjourn debate. Okay, so we're dilatory motion, and we're going to have a. Oui, il veut clore le débat là. So,
Yes, he wants to adjourn the debate. The clerk will record the vote.
In favor?
Madam Chatel? Mr. Longfield?
Yes.
Ms. Taylor-Roy?
In favor.
Mr. Vancouverton?
Yes.
Monsieur Dantel?
Entre.
Mr. Cram?
Yes.
Mr. Leslie? Mr. Mazier?
Yes.
Madame Posé? Mr. Bachrach? 7 yeas, 4 nays.
Alors, écoutez, collègues.
So, colleagues, we have barely 4 minutes remaining. We had agreed to stop the meeting at 1 o'clock, but could we have a motion to adjourn, given that we're running out of time? I move that we adjourn. Can we vote on it?
Didn't we vote at the very beginning of the meeting to adjourn at 10 to 1?
Well, we did, but I mean, I'm going to see. I'm gonna try and anyway. I'm gonna see how we can continue this discussion. But Well, we said we'd go to 1, and it's like like 4 to 1, 4 minutes to 1. Madame Chatel has. Where's Madame Chatel? Madame Chatel has asked for adjournment. So there's a motion. So to adjourn. So let's vote. Let's vote whether we adjourn or not. It's a bit academic because we're at 1 o'clock. Okay, we're voting on Madame Chatel's adjournment motion. Okay, can you? Okay.
So motion to adjourn the meeting. Mr. Ali?
Yes.
Madame Chatel?
Oui.
Mr. Longfield?
Yes.
Ms. Taylor-Roy?
Oui.
Mr. Van Couverden?
Yes.
Monsieur Datel?
Oui.
Mr. Cram?
Against. Against.
Mr. Leslie? Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Against. You said against.
Okay, yeah. Mr. Mesier? Madame Posey? Mr. Backrack? Okay. All in favor?
Okay.
Thank you, witnesses, and apologies.
Yeah, we apologize again. I apologize for